Today we're going to be looking at the urinary system. The urinary system, as the name suggests, are the collection of organs used to form and remove urine from the body. The organs include the kidneys, ureters, bladder, and urethra. For our purposes in this course, we're going to be focusing primarily on the kidneys and what they do. The kidneys, they filter blood, and they bring those contents down to the bladder via these two tubes known as the ureters. It's not quite urine as it leaves the kidneys, but they are products that will become urine as they get into your bladder. So the blood is filtered in the kidneys, the filtration is moved to the bladder through the ureters, the bladder stores it until you have to go to the bathroom, and then when you go to the bathroom, your urine comes out through the urethra, which is a tube that goes from the bladder to the external environment. Turning the page in your handout, you'll see this image, and underneath this image there are 3 questions. You might want to pause this video and take a look at those 3 questions so you know what you're listening for as you proceed with the video. Also be sure to label in the anatomical features of the kidney as they pop up on your screen. Popping up right here, we have the renal hilum. The renal hilum, also known as the renal sinus, is this region right in here. We can see the kidney is kind of lima bean shaped, and we have an indentation region on the medial side. This is where blood vessels, nerves, collecting ducts, which are kind of yellow on your screen here, lymphatic vessels, they all enter or exit the kidney at this specific location. And one more thing I would like to kind of mention before we get much further is you'll see the word renal appear quite a bit as we go through this terminology. Anytime you hear the word renal, that is talking about the kidney. It's something tied to the kidney. Next we have the major and minor calyx. We can see that the minor calyx attaches to this pyramid-looking thing, which then flows into this larger tube, the major calyx. The major calyx, tracing it backwards, goes through the renal pelvis and down into the ureter. So we talked about the ureter carrying contents that have been removed from blood away from the kidney down towards the bladder, and it starts with the major and minor calyx. So they remove the contents from the kidney down through the ureter and into the bladder. Next we have the renal cortex, which is the outer region, and the renal medulla, which is the inner region. We've heard cortex and medulla before. Cortex with the brain, and then both of these terms with the adrenal gland. Cortex means the outer layer of an organ. Medulla is the inner area of an organ. Within the renal medulla, we see those pyramids, which I actually pointed to this one down here. We'll talk more about what the renal pyramids do a little bit later. And then we have the renal columns, which are the spaces between the renal pyramids. We can see blood vessels going through those renal columns. Turning the page in your handout after you've answered those 3 questions, you'll see this image here. We're going to be looking at the blood path going into and out of the kidney, which only makes sense considering that the kidneys filter contents from our blood that later become part of our urine. So we kind of should understand the flow of blood through the kidney. On your handout, you'll find some numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Those are the steps of the blood path. We'll talk about why we skip from 4 to 9 here once we get to that point. But going into the kidney, we have number 1, the renal artery. The renal artery enters the kidney, and then we can see, just like we've learned previously, the arteries branch into smaller arteries. Well, the first division of branches beyond the renal artery are called the interlobar arteries. And we can see those right here, here, one here, another one here, here. Those continue to branch into smaller vessels known as arcuate arteries. So here we have an interlobar artery branching here and here into our arcuate arteries. And beyond the arcuate arteries, we branch into smaller blood vessels that look like they're extending up into the cortex, known as the interlobular arteries. So the interlobular arteries are these extensions going out into the cortex region. At this point, which is step 4, the blood vessels, they start to get really, really small. We can kind of see that going on from here. Larger, smaller, a little bit smaller, even smaller. At this region, they're starting to get so small that we can't really put them onto this picture. So we're going to look at our next picture down here. Out in the cortex region, we have a functional unit of the kidney known as the nephron. The nephron, we can see, is this kind of coiled and looped, snaking structure that kind of surrounds some of these blood vessels, which we can kind of see right in here. And this is where we start to actually filter the blood, which kind of makes sense. In order to move things into or out of blood vessels, those blood vessels need to be really, really small and have really, really thin walls so that things can actually enter or leave the bloodstream. So the nephron, it is where the filtration of the blood occurs. And the blood vessels that we see here, they do pass from the cortex region down into the renal pyramids, which are, recall, part of the medulla. So on our next slide, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the nephron in a little bit larger scope. Something to kind of consider, this nephron is going horizontal, but the one on our page we're going to be looking at vertically. And you do have some numbers and letters on this paper as well, like the letter A, which is the glomerular capsule, aka the Bowman's capsule. We can see that this part of the nephron, it's kind of C-shaped, and that there's some blood vessels within that capsule. The second part of the nephron is a tube that extends away from the glomerular capsule, and it kind of coils around as we see on our screen here. That is known as the proximal convoluted tubule, which makes sense because it's proximal to the capsule. Convoluted because, well, we see convolutions right here. The third part of the nephron, letter C down here, you can see that the convoluted tubule kind of dips down. That is called the nephron loop, or the loop of Henle. And that kind of loops around and it comes back up, all the while surrounded by blood vessels. Letter D up here, we see more twisted convoluted tubules, and we already had the proximal convoluted tubule, so these would be the distal convoluted tubules. They're far away from the capsule. And then the distal convoluted tubule starts to go down into the letter E, which would be a collecting duct. The collecting ducts of nephrons would enter into the minor calyx, go into the major calyx, ultimately flowing into the ureter, which would then remove the contents from here down to the bladder. So now that we've looked at the structure of the nephron, let's start looking at the blood vessels as they kind of intertwine with the nephron. We left off with step 4 of the blood path on the previous slide, which we recall was the interlobular artery, which branches into smaller blood vessels. Going back to the cardiovascular system, hopefully you recall that blood vessels after arteries are known as, number 5, arterioles. These arterioles specifically are the afferent arterioles, and the arterioles go into this capsule, and we can see they branch out, getting smaller, which would be step 6. And recall that after arterioles we have capillaries. These capillaries are collectively known as the glomerular capillaries or the glomerulus. Since we are in capillaries, hopefully recall that back to the cardiovascular system, gas exchange occurred between capillaries and the body. Now we have exchange occur between the capillaries and the nephron. So some things are going to be exchanged between these two parts within the kidney. We see blood vessels then leave the glomerulus. Step 7, those are our efferent arterioles. So we went from arteriole to capillary back to arteriole, still going away. Winding through the tubules deep into the loop of Henle, we have step 8, the peritubular capillaries. So we're back to capillaries from the arterioles, and when we're in capillaries, that implies things are exchanged. So some things will be exchanged between the capillaries and the loop of Henle. Then we have step 9, we're in the blue, so we're starting to leave the nephron through our interlobular veins. So we have interlobular up here, interlobular artery, interlobular veins. Hopefully you're starting to pick up on what the next one would be. So think about what came before the interlobular artery. Step 10 here. We had the arcuate arteries before, now we have the arcuate veins after. That brings us back to this picture here. Once again, in this picture we left off with step 4, the interlobular arteries, because we're starting to get too small, we're starting to get into arterioles and capillaries. Now we're going to be making our way out of the kidney. And we left off on the previous slide with, well, the one after this, the interlobular vein, you start to see coming back out of the cortex, which are forming into larger veins, the arcuate veins, and they're starting to wind back through the renal columns and the interlobar veins, starting to make our way back out of the kidney into our renal veins, which are a large one, which would then be entirely out of the kidney. So beneath this image you have a step sequence 1 through 12 where I'd like you to write in the pathway of blood throughout the kidney, going into the kidney, through the nephron, and then back out of the kidney. At this point, we've kind of gone through our discussion on the anatomy of the kidney and the sequence of blood flow. The last part of your notes/assignment is to be looking at the video of urine formation on the last 2 pages of your handout. There is a website link for a YouTube video at the top of your handout that will walk you through the process of urine formation. Please type that in exactly as you see it. If you do, the video will work. If the video is not working, you typed it in incorrectly. The process of urine formation has 3 steps, and they're kind of outlined in bold on your paper. Step 1 is glomerular filtration. Going halfway down your paper, you'll see in bold step 2, tubular reabsorption. And turning the page in your notes, you'll see step 3 in bold, tubular secretion. What you see underneath each of those, you'll see the letters A, B, C, sometimes D. That's not an outline of the sequence of urine formation. Those are actually multiple choice questions. So as you watch each section of that video, answer those 4 multiple choice questions. So question 1 underneath glomerular filtration is which items are removed from blood at this point? And you have 2 options, A or B. In the video, you could certainly rewind and rewatch to get those questions correct. After you've gone through the video and you've answered all of the multiple choice questions, which looks like in total there are 10, you can then use those multiple choice questions in your answers to them to write a formal summary of how urine is formed. And I provided some space on the back side of your notes where you can write that summary. Use the multiple choice questions as a guide, and you should have a high level of success. If you'd like to check your answers with me before you write that, you are welcome to do so, but you would need to see me to make that happen. Talk to you later. Have a great day.